people that make up what we think of as NewSpace. So in Pete, we have someone who's representing the civil space side of it. In Mike, we have somebody who's representing sort of the commercial space side of it. And finally, with Dan, we have somebody who's representing the military space side of it. And for me, I get to stand here from the Space Frontier Foundation and ask everybody uncomfortable questions. Very briefly, just so everybody knows, Pete is the director of NASA Ames. Mike is the president of the CSF, or the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, which represents commercial space companies in Washington, D.C. And Dan Mosqueda is the director of Air Force and National Security Programs at USRA. So, guys, I'm going to start you off with a question here. Oh, you've all got mics, so that's good. And then I'll probably sit down with you and keep this conversation going. So where I wanted to start then is, I look around, I realize this is going to be fun. I'm the young guy on the panel. And I realize that, and I think we all realize that when we think about the space industry, new space, everything else, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we'd all go to the same conferences, but we would talk about things that we hoped would happen one day. We would talk about how, well, one day the industry's not going to be stagnant. One day we'll be using something different. One day, on and on and on. But that's not what we're doing anymore now. I listen to your speech, I think about my speech, and we're talking about here's what's happening right now, and here's how we leverage that into what's going to happen soon. And things are moving much more quickly than they were. So given all of that, what's changed, what's different, and how do you see the next few years unfolding? What are the things that have you excited? What's different, and what's driving that difference? So it's a softball to start. And whoever wants to jump in first.
All right, thanks. Trouble being in the middle. Hear me okay? Great. Well, first, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Jeff.
Thank you much.
I think the answer is simple, one word, success. You know, when I was sitting at my desk at NASA about 3 years ago, and I mentioned to a colleague that I was contemplating coming to work for the Commercial Spaceflight Federation, and he referred to them as a bunch of tinfoil hat wearing Twinkies. So that sort of was indicative, I think, of at least some of the perception of the folks at NASA. Now, NASA is using commercial crew to routinely take cargo up to the International Space Station, which was developed and procured in a very commercial way. We're on the edge of awarding the next round of contracts to human spaceflight vehicle developers for the Commercial Crew Program. And so I think that person and a lot of other folks around probably sing a different tune, and I think it's because it works. We've been able to develop this cargo capability for a fraction of the cost of what it would have costed under traditional methods. The same is true in the Commercial Crew Program so far. On the suborbital front, we have people on the verge of taking people to the edge of space for sums of money that, while still pretty high, are much more attainable than ever thought possible. And so I think nothing makes a believer more than success, and that's sort of the simple answer of how we got here.
I'd say that, interestingly enough, one of the best things that happened, and go with me here, has been the budget cuts. Because what it's forced the government to do is it's forced us to really work hard at innovating and figuring out what we can do. So in the Air Force's case, what they've been doing is a lot of hosted payload work. All of a sudden they're going on, commercial satellites and things like that. They're also now looking much more closely at a lot lower cost launch and delivery systems. And additionally, General Warden and I worked together on a visionary panel where we tried to figure out, well, where are we going to be in 30 years in space? And the first thing that most of these guys came up with was, well, I guess the military needs to fix the way they acquire things if you plan on getting anywhere beyond where you are now. And it is something that they are working on actively. And then the next thing was, well, how do we bring in what, when we were writing up General Shelton, who was the commander of Air Force Space Command, we were writing up his strategy for innovation. We said, how do we bring in the mythical Joe's Garage, you know, the guy who's sitting out here or somewhere else in the country who's got a great idea, but there is no way he's going to be able to sell it to the government because of our shackles that we have in the forms of requirements and the joint processes in order to buy anything or build anything or fly anything. So the budget cuts have really made a big change in the playing field, and it's going to make people like you really end up benefiting.
Well, I think the biggest thing that's happened is Silicon Valley. You know, maybe I'm biased because I live here, but you know, if you think of a typical Silicon Valley billionaire, and there's quite a few of them, they grew up, you know, in the 70s, 80s, some of them even in the 60s, you know, old people like me did. And they all saw the Apollo program and said, you know, we want to make this happen, we want to do it, we want to fly to space. And then we weren't doing that. And so these are people that have gotten interested in space, and I'll say they're interested in two reasons. One is they can make money there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the other one is that they'd like to make things happen. You know, I had one of them tell me once, and I won't tell you which one, that said, you know, if you've got about 20, 30 billion, what do you do with that? Now, I wish I'd had that problem, but I said, I don't know, tell me. And he said, well, you know, you buy a big house and some yachts and maybe a few airplanes and some fast cars, and, you know, maybe you run through a few spouses. I told my wife that, and she said, you wouldn't have done that. Oh, no. But you know, so that now you've spent maybe a couple $100 million. You know, what do you do with the other 19.8 billion or so? And we're seeing a lot of these people get to the, you know, they're kind of starting to say, well, I'm in my 40s or 50s, and they're turning to space not just to make money, but as a philanthropic thing. I mean, you know, Musk doesn't expect to make money on Mars, but he wants to settle it. And he's not the only one. I think every one of these folks are very interested in these questions. So we're seeing really the emergence of a true space economy, powered by this Silicon Valley entrepreneurship. And I'll tell you, there's one, in fact, you can see one of the companies out here. You know, Silicon Valley was built on, you know, a couple folks sitting in their garage and doing something. And it's kind of the, you know, just what talked about here. And, you know, they're able to do software. Well, you know, Elon Musk and others said they could do hardware the same way, and, you know, rockets blew up and so on. But we're seeing a new development, the kind of, you know, maker movement or additive manufacturing, 3D printing, that two kids in their garage can now build stuff, and they can build satellites, and they can build space things. So I think we're going to see a huge explosion of entrepreneurship, and it's not really just here in Silicon Valley. There are other places in the world, you know, notably Tel Aviv, Shanghai, and other places that the space economy is emerging, and this is a huge thing. And us government guys are going to have to get used to, you know, okay, we're not necessarily going to do all this stuff. We're going to help them make it happen.
Well, let me sort of jump right on the heels of that. Then, when I spoke earlier, one of the points that I made was I said, NewSpace is about more than just business. I talked about it as a movement. You guys buy that? Do you like that? Do you not like that? Do you think, no, you know, this is just a business, the emergence of a new economy is just a business? Or is it something different? Anybody's viewpoints?
Well, I do buy it, and I think one of the interesting things when we worked on our visionary panel and when we worked on this innovation forum for the military is we didn't look at ourselves, of course, because as Brian Farron told us, we now take 8 years to develop requirements and pat ourselves on the back like that's a good thing. Of course, that means we've just built an obsolete $1 billion spacecraft. But what we did is we looked at all of these innovators and how are they doing it, and how could we even use some of their processes, or even open ourselves up so that, you know, the mythical Joe's Garage could come to us, present the idea, it would get looked at not by the naysayer or bureaucrat level, but at a more senior visionary level where they could see that idea and go, you know what, that is a good idea. We're going to work around our system and we're going to buy that, and that's going to help us, because it goes back to what the general had to say about the science aspect of all this, because you can't do what your end goal is without understanding a lot of the issues between Earth and where you want to get to. And obviously the military's got the deepest pockets to get a lot of that stuff done.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'd ask Jeff, what do you mean by a movement? I mean, give me an example of something else that's a movement. I'll tell you whether I think this is a movement or not.
That's good. So I think the way I would answer that is I would say, when I look at the folks who are here, you have people talking saying, I'm interested in being a settler. Look at Mars One. Mars One isn't there's money involved, but they're not out there to make piles of money. They're out there to accomplish something. They're using entrepreneurship and the internet and technology and all these tools to try to do something fundamentally different. They're not there just to make a business. Those are people who are, they're signing up for one-way tickets. And so you're touching you're touching sort of people's what they want to do with their lives, not how they're going to make a living and feed their kids. So does that seem like something different than just a business? And if it is, what is it? I think that's I think that's my question. Don't worry, it's not an easy question because I don't know the answer either.
Well, I think that this is a movement, but there's a danger in any movement. You know, the first step is when you're a bunch of prophets and people want to kill you, and that happened 5-10 years ago. And I think the comment made by your colleague at NASA headquarters was an example of that. However, the next step is where the movement begins to be popular, and then everybody says, well, that's me too. And we have a senior management council at NASA, and I can't get into the details, but I will tell this one out of school story. But a few weeks ago we had a strategic discussion, and the word NewSpace came up, and they all said they're NewSpace. These are the mission directors and center directors at NASA headquarters. So there's well, and there's all the big industry is here, and we're all wearing suits and not so one has to be very careful of being co-opted. Now, the good news is that a lot of them meant it. I mean, they weren't just trying to be me too. But there's a what I find quite admirable is that a few months ago, for the first time, I heard a NASA administrator say that our goal was to settle Mars, and he said that at the Mars Exploration Conference in Washington D.C. So, but one has to be careful that the movement begins to be co-opted. I mean, it's I'm kind of a fan of history, and the Soviet Union was based on kind of equality and workers doing things, and there's a famous joke which I can't resist telling. It was a Soviet joke, and this is when Leonid Brezhnev was the general secretary, that he wanted to show his mother how successful he was, so he was driving her around, showed her his Dasha and the airplane he had and the big limo and so on, and she was looking kind of more and more nervous, and she said, well, Leonid, what will happen if the communists come back? and so I think the thing here is to make sure you don't get co-opted, and insist that that we are going to do these things different. I think the space economy will help, but You know, there's a lot of people. I mean, I don't think you'll find anybody in Washington to say, "Oh, I'm not NewSpace." They're all NewSpace now.
That's troubling.
Yeah.
Well, I think then let me sort of shift us just a little bit on that then. If the concern, to some extent, is that you raise is the co-opting of the movement of sort of the Me Too stuff, but at the same time, we are acknowledging that something different is happening, that something that really hasn't happened before is happening. So if we're acknowledging both those things, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts sort of a little more narrowly and a little more specifically how the existence of the movement and where the everything is going, how does that affect your specific area of focus? So how does that affect things on the military side? On the commercial side, well, I guess that's a little more obvious, but on the NASA side, how is that changing how you do business? How is that changing what you're doing? So in each of your specific areas, what's changing as a result of this?
Well, you know, I don't want to be too much of a Debbie Downer here, but I mean, I think I don't love the word movement in this case. I think it's just sort of evolution. You know, as Dan brought up, people are starting to recognize both in civil space and military space that there's a better way to do things, and we can make things that we were making before less expensively, more efficiently, and basically allowing that to democratize access to space. And that's sort of a business evolution. You know, there is a groundswell of enthusiasm for that as Pete says, is sort of spread out to people who are not early adopters. But on the commercial company side, these guys are still trying to make money. I think that there are visionaries out there like Elon and others, but at the end of the day, you know, they are in the business to make money. And so it's all about getting investors. It's all about designing vehicles that actually fly, that actually take people and don't kill them. And these are all real hard technical problems. So I really want to bring the conversation to some degree back to the fact that getting into space is still very difficult and very dangerous and very technically challenging. And while it's great that more people are seeing that there are other ways to do that than the way we have been doing them traditionally, both in the military at NASA, we still have to do that, and we still have to continue to demonstrate success, because I think that a lot of these people who are, you know, maybe not the early adopters, but the middle people will abandon this movement pretty quickly if we start hurting people.
That's a really good point, and but I think part of it as the only aspect, not only, but one of the major aspects of a movement thing would be that a lot of the hurdles and a lot of the problems and the intransigence that you're going to find at any government agency, even within corporate structures, you know, it's really up to much like what U of M did with you know, going out to Kickstarter, right, and getting that money. It also takes each of you to no kidding, not just write a letter, but, you know, get on an airplane, sit down with your congressman, and say, look, here's how come I can't do my business. Here's how come I can't employ the 150 people I imagine I could employ. It's because while, you know, Dr. Warden would like to do this work, he can't because, you know, the requirements process is so convoluted that there's no quick track, that in our case in the military, we can't even do it unless it's what we call a bona fide warfighter requirement. Well, what if the warfighter doesn't understand that something that you want to do could help his mission? It might just be, you know, 1,000 CubeSats instead of, you know, a big billion-dollar gold-plated satellite, for instance. But if the rules aren't changed, there's not a lot that, you know, your movement's going to be able to do. So you have to almost stand up, and it's kind of goes back to you know, the democratization of space as well. And it's up to you, because frankly, you know, a lot of us are very limited in what we can do and what we can say, because either we're going to, from the commercial side, we're going to appear like it's self-serving, or even on the research and development side at USRA and other university organizations, we're going to appear like we're being self-serving as well. We're just trying to grab grant money or whatever. So it has to really come from the bottom. And the thing is if your legislators never hear from you, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, let me pick up on that. I mean, and I have sort of mixed feelings about the word movement as well. In fact, the older you get, movements have different meanings. You'll find out. You know, the word democratization is very important. And, you know, movements are ones that anybody can join. And I think those are the most powerful ones. And I think that, and there's going to be a couple aspects I briefly mention on it, that if anybody can go become part of space, can do something in space, it is what really empowers things to happen. And it's, you know, when you look at exploration hundreds of years ago, whether it's the Polynesian exploration or the European exploration or others, that what really made it happen was that, you know, 3 or 4 of us could get together and have a, you know, pint of grog, and, you know, we could afford a ship, and we could go someplace. And, you know, or if you were on a Polynesian island and you didn't like the king, you know, you and your friends got in a boat and, you know, went away and found another one. That's what's needed in one sense, and I think that's happening. The fact that you know, for a few $100,000 you can build a CubeSat. The fact that technology is going to enable you to take that CubeSat anywhere in the solar system, that begins to democratize it. The fact that you can be part of that through Kickstarter and other things democratizes it. One of the next developments is, you know, we've got some people at Cornell working with us to do ChipSats, and it was also funded with Kickstarter. And you know, these are things that weigh about 50 grams, and we think those could go anywhere in the solar system. So now you can buy one for your kid for Christmas, you know, and that's democratization. Now the other side of that, and I think that we shouldn't underestimate this, is that this is global. You know, we're going to space. You know, the people everywhere are interested in this. You know, you know, one of the things I do as a NASA senior official is I work with sort of emerging space countries. You know, and you don't really think of like Lithuania as a space power, but Lithuania has launched a couple satellites now that we work with them. I visited Lithuania and met with the Prime Minister. You know, that's, you know, mid-level government employees don't get to do that very often. A few months ago, I was in Jordan and was a guest of the Crown Prince. You know, these are things that we should not underestimate. Very great talent around the world. America has a chance to lead this movement, and they're all looking to us. They're excited about the private sector things. Lithuania, for example, is not trying to build a big government space program. It's trying to develop a consortium of private individuals. So the movement is spreading, and it's spreading so that everybody can be part of it. And I think we need to work very hard to continue that, because we all wanted to go to space. You know, and you know, I was 19 when Apollo 11 landed on the moon here 45 years ago, and I thought, well, I'll get to go too. In fact, one of the neighbors asked me what happened, you know, the same year that 2001 came out, and he said, "What do you think that we'll go to Jupiter, people, by 2001?" I said, "Oh, that's far too conservative. We'll be there in 1990," and we're not there, but now we can be there, and that's the exciting thing.
Well, I'm going to jump on my role as moderator, but before I do, you touched on one of my absolute favorite topics, and this is to the extent that I'm going to soapbox. This is my one moment. So, hang on, right? So, when in the previous historical analogy that we're kind of getting away from, that NewSpace is beginning to overwhelm, we always talked about, you know, the sort of no buck Rogers thing. Well, we got to have manned space flight because that's how we get it paid for. But I always feel like this is just, like I say, this is Jeff talking, but it always seemed like, well, why? I mean, why do we have to why is it important to fund human stuff? And more importantly, why do people get excited about human stuff? And I think you touched on it just there, at least in my opinion, was always because if humans are going, that means one day we'll get good enough at sending humans that I or someone like me could get to go. And it always seemed to me that what, more than anything else, although all the science stuff and all the technology stuff and all the business stuff and all the ideological people on Mars stuff is exciting, what's changing is if you're just an observer and you don't particularly care about this industry, but you think it's kind of cool and you think what's going on is kind of neat, now with the companies that are doing what they're doing, one can see the path. Before, it's hard to see how, my phrase about NASA astronauts was, how a bunch of guys better than me are ever going to be, how am I ever going to be that guy? I'm not going to be that guy. You know, I didn't get those grades.
They're not better than me. I didn't get picked, so obviously that's by definition.
Well, 2 for 2. So let me jump back to my moderating role then, and ask a different question. Before I do that, one other thing. Mike, I like your pushback on the words movement. The reason I like that is the purpose of, in my view, this organization and this conference is sometimes hashing out how we think about what we were doing. 15 years ago, this is my crack at being an old guy, when I first was here, we called ourselves the alt space movement, the alt.space movement. And I know a lot of the 20-somethings in the room are like, well, what's that even in reference to? So the words NewSpace, that's about 10 years old now, and that was what we came up with. And it may well be that 5 years from now we decide that no one knows what NewSpace means and we're something else. And it's okay to take the word movement and throw it out and say, no, we're democratizing space or something else. It sounds silly, but it's important to focus on our semantics. Let me switch over and be a moderator again. Okay, so something's going on, whether we call it a movement, whether we call it just an industry activity, whether we call it just technology development, just some new companies that are starting a new subsector, whatever it is, what's drawing people to it? Why are people excited about it? And by the same token, who's not excited about it and why? Who sees this as a threat? Who sees this as something that they would want to stop? Are we talking about, regulators? Are we talking about companies with a vested interest? Are we talking about, citizens? Are we talking about other countries? Who's excited about it and why, and what's drawing people to it on the one hand? Who doesn't think this is a great idea and why on the other hand?
Wow, I hate going first. So I think a lot of themes that we've already brought up are fundamental to answering your question. So who is excited about it and why? Why? Because there's success. And who? Everybody. Because of the reasons that Pete mentioned and you touched upon, which is maybe one day I get to go. I mean, that's what sort of, that's the wake that we're starting to be sucked into and drafting behind, which is exactly how it should be. I think the folks that are the least excited about it are the ones that have the most to lose. So you could figure out who those are. I mean, you could argue that it's old space, right? You could argue that it's companies or entities that somehow profited from the old way of doing business. And I think to some degree, as Dan mentioned, big bureaucratic organizations are very resistant to change. And so it's taken a long time for people at NASA to be able to say the words new space or word, is it one or two, by the way? Anyway, together, and now, like Pete said, everybody's saying that. So I think as we continue to succeed, people will continue to jump on board, a lot of them because they say, shoot, there's money to be made, I want to make money too, and a lot of them because they think that they may get to go to space one day or fly an experiment in space or have their children fly an experiment in space. So, I mean, it's all sort of tied into what we've already talked about. It's success, it's democratization of access.
And I can say that, when we were working on General Shelton and before that General Kaler's innovation, I can tell you every person in uniform, we were really excited about changing the way that we did things. We wanted to bring you in on, into our party to make it better, faster, and cheaper. We don't want 2 out of 3. We want all 3 of them. Of course, we want it to work. But there was a lot of excitement. I mean, we expended a lot of time, a lot of energy, and when we put the final ink down on this innovation strategy for the General, it went through every single layer of bureaucracy without one red pen touching it. And it was literally a miracle if you know how the government works at all. that it made it to the 4-star level and got signed off without a single change. The only problem is there was no funding to back some of the aspects of it, but interestingly enough, that's why I brought up the budget part. You know, all of a sudden these guys are going, well, we're gonna have to do something. So I think there's excitement at the troop level where we're like, you know, we wanna work with you because you guys are all smart. And we want that opportunity, and we do want new stuff in the sense of new ideas and new ways of doing it, because we look at it like Brand Farron looks at it, that, you know, it took them 8 to 10 years, I guess, to, you know, do the Apollo and get a rocket off the ground, and now we can't even hardly get a document out of the building for 8 years. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, that's very, very true. So there is excitement.
Well, I think that, you know, I mean, we've touched on it here that, you know, there's a famous quote from Machiavelli's The Prince that said that changing the order of things is the hardest task of all, because all of those that have something to lose with the new order will be vicious enemies, and those that have something to be gained will be sort of lukewarm supporters. So I've seen some of this. You know, I won't tell you which company, but a senior executive a few years ago, you know, I was showing them the neat small satellites we're doing, and how much does this cost? And, you know, it was like 60, 80 million, and I said, well, you know, it's kind of hard to meet the bottom line of our company. You know, we sell billion-dollar, you know, multi-billion-dollar satellites, and we're going to sell an awful lot of those $100 million ones to meet the bottom line, and so we're going to be a little cautious on this one. So I think what we talked about also earlier was the idea, the paradigm. We need to get buy-in, and you need to show these folks there's something to be gained. One of the other big aerospace companies, you know, that builds big satellites, I noticed has a significant investment in CubeSats. So, you know, I think that that's the real answer, that you know, to work very hard. So it's good that NASA leadership thinks they're NewSpace, and to show them there's something to be gained. I think the same with DoD. You know, some of the generals you mentioned when we were colonels and 1-stars were my vicious opponents about these kind of things, and so I find it ironic that suddenly they're the biggest advocates, but that's good, and that's the real thing. There's money to be made, there's missions to be accomplished. In the case of NASA, you know, we have the same budget problem, that you know, to do the missions we have, we needed about $3 or $4 billion more per year. We're not going to get that. So people are now saying, you know, well, maybe I can do those things if I, you know, look at these small things, that I work in partnership with international partners or with the private sector. So we're seeing you know, and I think it's each of our responsibilities to, when you confront with somebody that's a skeptic, is to kind of think about, okay, why are they a skeptic? Well, you know, they benefit from the old order. I mean, they might not even realize that they're a skeptic. It's sort of a subconscious thing. Show them and give them opportunities to say, you know, if I adopt this new approach, I can make more money, I can do more with less money, and it's hard, and it's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. You know, that you have to keep working on it. So it is happening, but at the same time, be careful not to be co-opted. You know, there's a tendency that small sats get big pretty fast, and cheap projects get expensive pretty fast, and you know, you know, I've got a lot of stories, and you know, I'll tell somebody in a bar about a cheap sat that suddenly cost $150 million.
Yeah, requirements creep, you know, obviously.
Just classify it then.
That's a way to triple the cost.
Well, I just meant so then you don't have to admit that it happened. In a few moments, I'm actually going to turn this over to the audience. So if you've been sitting around saying, I might have a question, start thinking it through, because in a few minutes, I'm going to pass my microphone down and let the volunteers here pass it around and really make it hard for this group up here. But before we do that, I suppose my next question is, how do from the seat that each of you are sitting in, how can we talk about some actual, down in the weeds a little bit, some substantive ways that you can take advantage of the new capabilities coming online. Mike, I know that's a little bit of a strange one for you because you're here representing folks who are doing these sort of things, but I suppose for the other two panelists, the question is really, can we give some clear examples of these new companies are doing things an awful lot cheaper. Yeah, you can buy cheap satellites and you can buy cheaper rides than you used to be able to do it, but how do we go farther than that? What's the next step?
Well, I mean, one of the clear examples, and he's not exactly small, but it was the issue with the Delta rockets. So now we're having to look a lot more closely at, using the Falcon line of rockets to actually do military space missions, which we had not done much of, a little bit here and there, but also some other areas that we're, using smaller companies and looking at them. I can't discuss some of the companies because some of it was proprietary, but it was the concept of getting launch costs down to maybe millions versus hundreds of millions. Another really good example at the visionary panel, which we actually came up with, and we actually have money funding it, is doing basically 3D printing of satellites on orbit. And the concept is that we're going to have this printer on orbit, and we might use a railgun or something like that just to launch the materials very cheaply up to that, and have it, they would meet up and then refill the printer, and then crank out your completed CubeSat to do whatever your mission is. And then the other one I mentioned, early on was hosted payload. I'll tell you, I bet you 30 years, if you had gone to somebody in military space and said, well, we're going to put our GPS, on the side of a commercial ComSat, they'd been like, the hell you are. It would have never happened. But it's happening now.
Well, I think a lot of the answer is in technology, and the technology is making it possible to do things. And let me mention a NASA program, which I have to, freely confess I was not a fan of, but now I am, which is the International Space Station. It has become an incredibly capable platform that's, you can argue about, was it worth all the money we paid for it, but we paid for it. And there's two things in particular that I want to talk about. First is launch. I mean, we have a lot of opportunity to launch stuff to the station and from the station. That is really democratizing things. The other one is a technology which, we don't talk much about in the NewSpace, and that's biological technology. We are entering an era where we can engineer biology, where we can do what's called synthetic biology. And the space station is going to be a good lab for that. But ultimately, what you want to go into space is a programmable, self-replicating machine. And the biologist in the audience will tell you, well, we've had that for billions of years. It's called life. And I really believe that we are approaching an era where we can grow satellites. That we can program biology to do things. It is, by the way, it's the kind of the big boom area in Silicon Valley. So, and I think it's the key to living on the moon, living on Mars, extracting things from asteroids. So I would encourage folks to expand your horizon in terms of technology, to not just think about, metal and rockets and, satellite pieces, but think about biology.
That's a really interesting sentiment. I've got to jump on one thing that you just said, though. The ISS is an interesting example and it's a really interesting example for the Space Frontier Foundation. So a little before I got involved, some of you may remember, some of you may know, that one of the loudest voices for don't fund it, don't build this stupid thing, was the Space Frontier Foundation. And now when we look at the example that you gave of NanoRacks, who are the founders of NanoRacks? Oh wait, they're foundation advocates and they're foundationers, and they were some of the same people making those arguments. So, I guess that hits a couple of points. One can transition how we look at things, but there's also who are the doers in the industry. They're the folks right here. So I'm going to pass this mic down, and then I'm going to take my place at the podium and do a whole lot of pointing and decide who gets their question answered. So we'll get on here. Joe, you want to go first?
Pete brought up a key issue. It's now socially acceptable to talk about settlements, even in Washington, even NASA administrators and national space policies. The problem I see is that we somehow have the idea that it's mostly about transportation. Terrestrial settlements, the major problem wasn't transportation, it was staying healthy and getting enough food in a new environment. And other than, Pete, your comment about biology, I'm not seeing any, I mean, the success of a settlement is going to depend far more on whether you can grow stuff on Mars or the moon or whatever than on whether you can reduce the price of rockets by another factor or two. I don't see this being discussed in an integrated way. This panel is integrated vision. I'd like to hear comments about that.
Well, I mean, I think it's beginning to be. Again, the last couple senior NASA meetings, increasing discussion. I mean, the administrators said, look, biology and growing things, living off the land is our important area. NASA's beginning to fund fundamental biology in a big way. The amount of money is going way up. So I think that we're beginning to see that. In fact, there's a new buzzword in Washington and called massless exploration. And we're hearing more and more about it, and things like 3D printing, using resources you find there, using biology to extract resources and into do things. In fact, I mentioned perchlorate on Mars. The only way I can see to handle that is probably biological. There are organisms that eat perchlorate on Earth. And so when you start to look at what we're going to do, this buzzword, massless exploration, is going to be increasingly important. And we're just beginning to hear the buzz, and I think that as NewSpace folks, you can all be disciples for that.
I think that's a fascinating, thought-provoking question, and it's a little troublesome. And here's, I don't have an answer, but I'll propose a hypothesis. I think that things like that. So my understanding of your question, anyway, is why aren't people doing more to try to understand how we can live in situ? Right? So I'm afraid that the only place that that's going to happen now is indirectly, at least through government funding, through grants or through NASA research or whatever. And the reason is there's no money to be made in that right now. And the reason there's no money to be made is because there aren't any habitats out there that need that kind of thing. And until there is that, the commercial guys are not going to get involved unless they get money from the government. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg argument, but I'm afraid that that's kind of where we are.
And the only thing I would add to that is, and that's really 100% true, the good thing, though, about looking at what we've done, kind of a benefit of the guns and butter debate is certainly in the military we definitely know how to make something small, move it somewhere else, and expand it into something we live in and work from. I mean, we can set up a base in the middle of a desert in no time at all and have air conditioning. I guess the answer to your question is how do you then make it, something you can live in?
Stay healthy and get
Yeah.
food.
Yeah, well, let me, I should probably, I think there's not a lot of money outside the government, but I think it's beginning to flow. I mean, one of our partners that we've signed agreements with and done some experiments is J. Craig Venter. He's the guy that, did the first human genome. He's really kind of invented the field of synthetic biology. He's, I'll be a shameless promoter for him. He wrote a book called, I think, Exploration at the Speed of Light, or some such title. And he got money from DARPA to figure out how to decode a genome and transmit it and reassemble it. He called me about a year ago and said, why are you guys bringing samples back from Mars? And I said, well, because that's how you study whether there's life there. He said, well, the only really interesting thing is there is life. He said, why don't you just send a little box, and you find life, you put it in the box, and it decodes the genome, and then it transmits that back to Earth, and we reassemble it in a P4 containment facility, or something higher even, and study it. And he said it's probably got some sort of, genetic code that's, carbon-based, so you could crack it. And I said, well, that's really neat, but that's going to be, like decades in the future. He says, no, we can do it right now. So we went out in the Mojave Desert, found cyanobacteria, which is the kind of thing you might find on Mars, and we programmed it and sent it, back, and they're going to reassemble it. But he sees a lot of commercial value to this on Earth. I mean, value for the military. If you're someplace and you have a pathogen, you don't want to bring it back, but you need right away that you crack it, or crack its code, send it back to the lab in the U.S., reassemble it, figure out what it is and what to handle it. So this is the kind of thing I think that the very creative private sector working with us is going to develop. That's the secret to living on Mars. It's a secret to exploring and with minimal mass throughout the solar system. By the way, he thinks it's the secret to go settle any planets we find around Alpha Centauri. So I think we're beginning to see this, and I do urge, we all think about, and I want to keep foot stomping this, that, and by the way, I'm a zealot, which usually happens when you're a convert, is about biological sciences. I think they are a key to what we want to do in space.
Man, guys, we got to hang out more. I learn all kinds of interesting stuff here. Let me, I'll give Gary the next one.
So I was excited by this session because you say integrating the vision. And I've heard each of you speak about mostly your own worlds of civil, commercial, national security. What are the worst barriers that keep you from working together, and what are the most important things that could be done to have your different worlds work together? I know that often your worlds don't work even internally together all that much within the civil space world, within national security world. How can all of you combine your forces and accelerate progress?
Well, I'll give you a real quick answer. The biggest barrier is Washington, D.C., and the most promising thing is Washington, D.C. So, in the, as a government person, that, whether it's congressional interest or regulations or bureaucratic things are a barrier. But at the same time, if one works closely with those people, I mean, they're all, I'll assume they're all well-meaning, and I think they are. But one has to go and just find a way to do it. Mike Griffin was my boss for a while, and one of the things he liked to say is you need a yes if answer, not a no because. So don't tolerate no because. If it's a cool thing, say, okay, how do we do this? Is there a law that needs to be changed? Is there and work with and change. And I'll just give you a minor example, but we live in Silicon Valley where you can buy electric cars. In fact, I have an electric car, and I've probably got 10% of my staff with electric cars, and they said we'd like to have charging stations at Ames. Well, the attorneys said it's against the law. Can't sell power, and so I said, well, we got to find a way to do that, and indeed we have. Some of the other NASA centers have found ways to do research projects where you can do it. But ultimately, we can change the law. So we've gone to the local congressional delegation. There's a bill making its way through Congress. It'll get attached to something. It's bipartisan, that will allow the government at its facilities to sell power to folks. I mean, okay, that's not a working together, but it's an example of always find a yes if. And that means you got to sit down and say, okay, how could we do this? How could I work with Defense Department better? And it's a lot. It's hard. But it's the job of all of us. How can I work with the private sector better? It's that's in fact that's what the Spaceflight Federation is all about. Is coming to us and say, well, if you guys fix this, stupid bureaucracy, we could do a lot more. And I think that's that's really the answer. It's hard, but that's our job.
I don't have much to add. I would basically agree that it is about the stupid bureaucracy to some degree. It's about requirements. So, I mean, you can hierarchically say perhaps that the commercial I'm just talking about launches as an example. They have maybe the least stringent requirements, and then civil space requirements are a bit higher, and then DoD requirements are the highest in terms of reliability and, you know, the figures of merit that people use to measure how successful, the likelihood of success. And it's incumbent upon the commercial world to demonstrate that without having those requirements imposed upon them, they can still be that successful. And I mean, this is what's happening right before our eyes in the whole SpaceX DoD debate. And you know, we'll see how that turns out, but that's an example about how this is going to happen. So I think the answer to your question is this integration will occur over time. I think it's a logical evolutionary step. It's just that evolution takes a long time.
And I would say, would add to that, you know, in our case, what we did is we actually spent a good chunk of that year looking at what are the barriers, because it was always the, you know, it was the naysayers, no, you can't do it because of, you know, this or whatever, and how do you overcome it? And I think a good example of how we did overcome that was ORS, Operationally Responsive Space, where, you know, in 3 years we went from nothing to an on-orbit, you know, military piece of hardware that was providing critically needed intelligence to a warfighter like that, right? You know, we bought commercial off-the-shelf stuff, you know, and there are ways. The IED problems in Iraq and Afghanistan were the same thing, where we went in and said, look, we got to break all these rules, you know, to save lives. Well, this is the same kind of thing. It's what, you know, we're talking about. Sometimes you're going to have to go talk to your congressman and say, I can't get this done because of this reason. How can you help me break through this, you know, this particular barrier? There was one other thing that popped through my mind. Oh, well, you know, as a shameless plug for USRA, one of the things that we do is we'll bring universities and researchers together with the government in order to get something done. And in my case, in my particular area of the company, you know, we don't do this very often, but we provided an astronomer to the Air Force Academy to help do research on space situational awareness, which Dr. Beeson will talk about, you know, later in the conference. And we actually paid for it out of pocket, and there was really not a lot of benefit to us other than gaining valuable research, right? So how do we work together? Well, the other thing that I've been trying to do as a personal mission in my civilian job at USRA is making sure that the Air Force and the Army and the Navy understand that NASA Ames can do stuff, that NASA Glenn can do stuff, and that they don't need to reinvent the wheel, that there actually is all this other stuff going on. And oh, by the way, Army Research Lab is doing this kind of thing as well. And it's what you said, you know, one hand doesn't know what the other one is doing. Well, that's not a very good answer anymore in a fiscally constrained environment. So hopefully you'll see, start to see some change, but at the end of the day, it's up to you. You have to make that change.
Sounds easy, guys. All you have to do is fix Washington dysfunction, and then we're good to go.
We're part of that. That's the thing.
Oh, my bad. Please.
At the NSS, we've been thinking about replacement for ISS, and what we're headed for, I haven't approved it, what we're headed for is the notion of doing it something like COTS and commercial crew, where the end result is you know, multiple stations owned and operated by multiple private entities that the government can be an anchor tenant or and maybe help with the development. So the question I have is, from each of your areas, is that a good idea? Is that something that NewSpace can pull off? And how would it affect the way you did business if we did that?
Well, I'm happy to be first answering that question. Absolutely. I mean, I think that is COTS and commercial crew have been great models, and there's no reason not to extend that to some sort of a habitat. We've kind of tackled the transportation in what I think is a logical way with cargo first and then people. And now what? You know, as Dan has mentioned, in this fiscally constrained environment, we can't afford another $100 billion space station for sure. And if we're going to take advantage of what we've invested and maintain a human presence in low Earth orbit, the way to do that is to gradually commercialize the ISS. And I think folks like Bill Gerstenmaier are already talking about that. So I think you're absolutely right on.
I'd like to underscore it's already happening. I mean, we're in discussions with people like Bigelow about, associated space stations. The CASIS group using this space station commercially. NanoRacks is a good example. I think it's happening. I think it's something that we want to encourage. And it's sort of, the more that you can do to popularize that notion, I think the better, the faster it'll happen. But, and of course, not just this station, but, other stations. If we, at some point, obviously, we think the Moon-Earth Lagrange point is a perfect place for a station, especially if we have large-scale lunar activities, and there's a lot of commercial opportunity, so yes.
All right, glad everybody likes that idea. Charles, I'll let you have the next one.
Yeah, I have a hobby horse which I like to bring up at these sorts of things, and I think Michael alluded to the issue for this sort of problem, and that is that 50 plus years into human spaceflight, we have not done variable gravity studies at partial G levels up to 1G to see what's needed to keep vertebrates and humans healthy. Just something that I think is of crucial importance.
Well, maybe I can answer that. The answer is that you're absolutely right. It was a stupid mistake not to do that. We originally had planned to have a large centrifuge on the ISS, and a decision was made. I think a very bad decision. I'll freely say that, not to do that. I mean, part of it was our partners didn't have the money to do it, but we are doing things. In fact, we launched here a couple months ago a CubeSat that was called SporeSat that had variable gravity. Unfortunately, something didn't work with it, so we're going to launch it again. That's the nice thing about CubeSats. But there is an experiment that's going to be launched by our German colleagues, the German Space Agency that NASA is working closely with, called Eucropus.
Okay,
it's looking at plant growth and in variable gravity. It's a rotating satellite. Probably think it's 2016 launch is. We're looking at doing synthetic biology on it. There are plans to put centrifuges, that could have small animals on board the ISS. Indeed, here in about a month, we launched the first rodent habitat that we built at Ames. It's not quite big enough yet to put Washington bureaucrats in, but it's got the right name, right?
Well, you'd have to raise them from infancy.
But I think this is happening. One of the other answers, of course, is that, well, rather than put a centrifuge, why don't you just put stuff on the surface of the Moon and Mars? I'll shamelessly, flack a Ames proposal. We have submitted a proposal for Mars 2020 to grow a plant on Mars. We're also looking at working with MoonX and others to put a plant growth module on the Moon. So, rather than try to simulate it, it might be cheaper, especially with some of these commercial and opportunities, to just, put something there and study it. But you are absolutely right. The partial gravity is the critical question, is whether we can live on the Moon and Mars. Yeah. And people are beginning to pay attention to. That's the good thing.
Well, good luck.
I'll throw one of my own, and then we'll do these last two, and I think that'll pretty much wrap us up for today. We'll start with Mike, but please, other guys, jump in a little bit on this one. When we look at the industry side of NewSpace, could you give us an example, or is there anything that comes to mind of things that look really good ideas today for the industry, or a little more broadly, that are actually big risks in your mind? Is there anything, and other guys please feel to jump in, is there anything that, like I say, looks good today, but we might be moving in a dangerous direction where we're all jumping on something? I mean, an example that would come to mind is, I think about the companies that are doing commercial crew. Everyone's excited, it's commercial, it's everything else. But there is a risk that they just end up being NASA contractors, and this whole vision of it'll get cheaper and all of us get to go, maybe that doesn't even work out if it's not done right. That might be an example, but I don't know. Is there something that we're doing now that seems like a good idea that might be a risk to all of us?
So your question is not technical, it's more programmatic, like is there an idea out there?
It could go, you take it wherever in the world you want.
Yeah, I have to tell you, that doesn't keep me up at night. I mean, I'm not conscious of any thing that the industry is trying to do that I think is a really bad idea. I think if there's something that keeps me up at night, it's just that we need to stay on top of being safe and being as diligent as possible about things that at first blush might be thought to be second thoughts in the commercial world, like quality control, like process control and things like that. So, but part of being a commercial space company is you want to make money, and you're not going to make money if you hurt people. And so that has to be part of the discussion, and it is absolutely fundamental that, particularly from where we came and with whom we're being compared, we are as safety conscious and as steely-eyed about that as we can possibly be.
Okay.
I would say probably the one issue that maybe we would run into on the DoD side is that, let's say somebody has an idea and they're going to launch a CubeSat to perform a given mission, or that maybe we would just buy the data from them, for instance. And there's a lot of that going on out here, right, where these Google's buying the company to provide imagery. One of the biggest issues we have is, how do we know that data is accurate and true and correct? And we've run into this over and over again with the SSA, where we pretty much are only going to use government-owned sources because we don't trust anything else. So the trick is how do you validate your data and what it is that you're doing to satisfy what are obviously stringent requirements by the government.
Well, I think the standard problem is be careful what you promise, and this is with the commercial crew. I mean, we will have problems at some point. There may be an accident, but one needs to be upfront, and it's always better to be a little pessimistic than too optimistic. Let me give you an example, just where I learned my lesson. We had two missions that the last few years that the public had a lot of interest in, or we had many, but one of them that Ames had was the L-Cross mission I showed. We had simulations and PR things that showed this giant explosion, and people were expecting to see a chunk of the moon, blast off. And when we actually had the mission, you could see a little tiny flash of light, from the spacecraft, and pictures, and people said, "That's it." Now, conversely, when NASA did the Curiosity landing, we had a lot of PR about how dangerous and how this could fail, and 7 minutes of terror, or 9 minutes of terror, videos, and then that it was successful, and people said, "Wow, what an impressive thing." So I think it's important when you do publicity, for whether it's a private sector thing or government or military or anything, don't underestimate the risk when you talk about it. Because I think that overselling is and zealots tend to do that. I mean, oh yeah, we're going to settle Mars in 2022, and people say, well, you mean 2122, so you have to be careful. And as an optimist, I always have to be reminded, and I think you do as well.
If I could, I apologize, but I do want to piggyback on that, because it's an absolutely fundamental point. And there's a big difference between how the government can address its risk exposure and how a private company can. And so I think the 7 minutes of terror was a great example of how they really played up, hey guys, chances are this isn't going to work. And when it worked, everybody was jumping up and down, slapping each other on the back, rightly so. Commercial guys don't do that because they need investors, and they're not going to say, hey, there's a pretty good chance that this is going to work. Oh, let me take out my checkbook. I mean, that's not a conversation that's going to happen. So it's a really fine line, and I'll be the first to say that it's not unusual for our commercial companies to overpromise. I mean, people have been saying we're going to be doing suborbital human spaceflight next year for 8 years now.
2 years, Mike.
Well, okay. But it's, you know, it's difficult, it's challenging, and it's a needle that's got to be thread between over-promising and therefore, you know, being disappointing your public, your customers, or under-promising and not getting investors and not having a business to begin with.
Okay. We'll do these last 2 questions, and then we'll call it a day. So you've got the next to last.
Thanks. Sean McClinton, Space Entrepreneurs up in Seattle. Just watching what's happening in Russia, and you know, I'm kind of wondering, from your guys' perspective, are we losing a key partner? Is it going back to more almost Cold War status? I mean, what you mentioned Shanghai, Lithuania, the world movement, but you know, what does it mean to you guys? What's happening, and is the space, you know, is what's happening in space kind of insulated to an extent from that? Or what's your perspective there?
Well, maybe a brief answer to that. Yes, it's a concern. I mean, Russia is a very important partner on the International Space Station. We've worked very hard to, as much as possible, insulate NASA programs from it. You know, I hope we're successful. In fact, actually, I'm tentatively in September supposed to go to Russia to watch a launch of Soyuz, and I'm hopeful, and you know, I use the word hopeful, not necessarily optimistic, but that, you know, these kind of crises will be worked internationally and get us through that. I think the world is not the same place it was in the Cold War, and I certainly hope it isn't. On the other hand, you know, there's a silver lining to every cloud. I think the silver lining here is that the United States government has certainly realized that we have to insulate ourselves from these kind of things. I mean, I'll be shamelessly self-promoting that, you know, I negotiated the original deal for the RD-180, and we put some clauses in there that you know, we were going to get the drawings and co-produce that engine. I'll tell you, some of the generals that now are suddenly become converts took the money out of the budget, and I mean, there were overruns. I mean, they made bad decisions, but we didn't do that. And so I think there's always a reminder that, you know, no matter how good of an ally or friend you have, that, you know, they have their own interest, and that one needs to insulate yourself from that. And we're seeing that kind of lesson being relearned that says that, okay, if you buy somebody else's engine, you know, make sure you have also bought the rights to co-produce it. So there's there's potentially good news about all this, and I'm actually kind of optimistic that we'll get through it without a, you know, huge problem.
Yeah, I am too. I mean, I'll talk about the ISS piece. Maybe Dan could talk more about the RD-180, but, you know, having worked with those guys a lot and trained over there, I can tell you that at the working levels, absolutely no, you know, division between us. I think that's true at the management level as well. And I know from talking to NASA officials that their counterparts are in total solidarity with us. Obviously, this is a small piece in a much bigger machine, which is a geopolitical thing that's going on. And, you know, in that regard, nobody knows what's going to happen. And if Putin decides to put that on the table, then, you know, the guys that are the NASA management counterparts, they're just going to salute and say, okay, whatever you say, boss. So, I mean, it is a threat, but, you know, a lot of these things come up and they go away, and I'm hoping that this is like that, and I think in the end that's probably what will happen.
Yeah, and interestingly, I worked, I was the operations and plans officer for the Treat and Open Skies, which is where we work with the Russians, and they fly over the U.S. and we fly over them. And, you know, I agree at the working level, you know, we're all very good friends, know them. A lot of the Russian officers I worked with knew my kids. So I think that, you know, we can work through it. The trick is the geopolitical aspect of it going to explode? If, you know, are we looking at, you know, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand here or not? And if we are, we got big problems. If we're not, it's just a ripple, and, you know, Putin, you know, and President Obama will, you know, kiss and make up, and everybody will hold hands, and we'll start buying their engines, or being able to produce them, I should say. It's worth watching. I don't think that I would lose any sleep over it right away.
Thank you. Okay. You get the last one of the day, or the morning at least.
I'm Dave Oren with USRA. I'm wondering about, there's an analogous technology that we have historically in the United States, which I think is the harnessing of the fission back in the 50s. And it's kind of followed a similar path as the space program. And there's been democratization, there's been co-opting, there's been military issues associated with it, non-proliferation, things like that. And essentially, we've killed the program. We've killed civilian nuclear power in the United States. There's a couple of plants being built now. There's 70 being built overseas because we don't have this behemoth of the political, military, and regulatory risk management that is over it in other countries. And that kind of puts me in I don't see a clear path forward for NewSpace. So what I'd like to hear from you guys is maybe one thought that you could leave the audience with to help them continue the vision and just leave everybody on a positive note, essentially, that we won't, in the U.S., we can be just as competitive here and not have to go to elsewhere in the world.
Well, maybe just quickly, I mean, I think that's a good cautionary note that, you know, the whole nuclear industry in the U.S. has suffered from, you know, bad information. I'll even say propaganda. I think space is a little different. You know, the nuclear industry had, part of the problem is that we had nuclear weapons. So that from the start, the technology was a threat. Now, ICBMs were also a threat and were space technology, but we've managed to convert those, I think, pretty well. We launched Laddie to the moon on one. But it's very important when somebody starts talking about the risk is that we don't allow baloney to stay on the table. And that's what happened there. There was a lot of misinformation, disinformation. The other thing I think is really important, and we need to continue to do this, is to work with Hollywood and entertainment industry to make sure, you know, that, you know, they do things that sell movies and entertainment, is to make sure that they can sell more entertainment with movies like Gravity than they can with, you know, 3 Mile Island kind of, you know, scary things and, you know, nuclear zombies and so on. So it's a risk, and whenever you know about it, and the Hollywood people, they come and talk to all of us, you know, don't give them some sensational evil thing that happens in space, you know, that, you know, the aliens will attack and so on. I mean, give them the, you know, this is our future. This is a positive thing.
Yeah, I guess I would, it's an interesting analogy that you draw, and I'm not really convinced that it's applicable. And I think a couple of places that I see differences are, you know, the nuclear threat or risk has always started out as being, it's a weapon, right? I mean, it was something made to hurt people. And I don't think space travel by humans certainly has ever been put in that context. I mean, people think of that as a feel-good story much more than a scary story. Secondly, from a danger standpoint, you know, the overwhelming kind of game-changing massive amounts of destruction that were capable was a nuclear weapon or even a civilian plant gone wrong, a la Chernobyl. You know, there's nothing like that in flying to space. So I'm hopeful that those two sort of things, at least in probably in conjunction with others, make it different enough. But let me end on the positive note that you were looking for. I mean, there's no place in the world where commercial space is as on the map as it is here in this country. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, that some people in this room have actually helped put the framework in place, to the entrepreneurial, innovative American spirit of business that has been able to, you know, take that opportunity and seize it and make real thriving business models that can work. We are at the very, very tip of the spear, and I don't really see too many countries that are even, thinking about heading in the same direction. So we have an incredible advantage, and I don't really see much threat to our leadership in that world.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, and I think it's interesting because even with what we're doing with our interns who are at NASA and AFRL and different parts of the government, these are young people who are getting excited about all this stuff. They're going to continue to work in these programs. They want to be like him. They want to fly to space, or they want to be like General Warden and lead the engineering efforts or scientific efforts or whatever. And I don't think that that it's going to have, certainly doesn't have that same shadow hanging over it as, the perceived dangers of, nuclear power, et cetera. Plus you've got a lot of advocates in the room, who are out there, providing good facts on how safe we are, like Space Foundation, has done every year at the National Space Symposium, and that brings everybody, together to work as well. So I think there's a lot of momentum, and I can't see it backsliding, and we're going to have to move forward. And I do think you've caught today's younger generations pretty excited about seeing this stuff. It's very similar to what we went through with the Apollo program when my son is always blown away that we have a flag from Apollo 17. My wife's godfather was Ron Evans. And they're still excited from that stuff, way back then. So I think it's just a whole different trajectory, if you will, than what we unfortunately faced with nuclear power. And even on the ICBM side, because I was an ICBM launch officer for my first assignment in the Air Force, now look at what the old boosters are being used for. They're launching stuff into space, probably some of your CubeSats or whatever that experiments that you're working on.
Well,
As long as Homer Simpson works in a nuclear plant, not a rocket plant, we're okay.
Well, I really do appreciate this panel, and you got me with your question, so I have to close this out with a note speaking on behalf of the foundation. The part of your analogy that I would poke at is the phrasing of when we're talking about NewSpace as the space program. So to use the classic line from the Space Frontier Foundation, space is a place, it's not a program. What differentiates NewSpace from everything that's been done before is increasingly we're talking about companies that are doing things in space with their own money or with other private sources and not having to rely on government funding to do what they're doing. Now, obviously, that's still the big source, but what I think differentiates NewSpace is that that's changing and that lots of commercial companies are able to jump in. So a very exciting time. I really appreciate the comments of the panel. So thank you so much, guys.
I'd like to thank our panelists again and the moderator. Thanks. We're going to be taking a break now until 10:40, so about 20 minutes. We'll be having coffee next door in the exhibit hall, and I asked to remind everyone about the tickets they received from Made in Space. They can turn those in at the exhibit next door. If you got one of the other ticket stubs, you can get one of the Made in Space tickets at the registration desk.
Thank you.
So we'll be breaking for 20 minutes, and then we'll be resuming with the lightning pitch competition. Thanks.